6 and probably get into chapter 7. And then after this, the idea of the sacrifices, the laws and the statutes pertaining to the sacrifices are pretty much over and done with. At this point, we get into the idea of the priests' offerings, and then it kind of segues into some day-to-day, everyday living, some things that God put into place for the children of Israel that were very particular to them. It's very interesting. Read forward a little bit and look and see how ingrained the law was in their life. The law dictated almost every aspect of their daily living, almost every bit of it. How they interacted with their neighbors, how they interacted with people who are from the outside coming in. You know, a lot of people would say that God would tell the Israelites, you know, you're supposed to, whatever you need to do in order to get one over on these nations that lived around you, and that's not what he said at all. He said you're supposed to treat everybody fairly. The people coming in from other countries, when they came in to do business with you, you treated them fairly. You were not supposed to have one measuring weight for one person and another measuring weight for another person. They were supposed to be equal, and God dictated what those were. So it's really interesting how deeply he was involved in their everyday lives. So anyway, chapter 6 and verse 8, and we'll read this a little bit, and then we'll drop down and discuss. So chapter 6, verses 8 through 13. Let's read that, and then we'll kind of go over it real quick. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, and now remember at this point, God is still speaking to Moses. He is with Moses in that tabernacle, and I'm going to bring in a slide that shows what the tabernacle looked like. I think probably everybody's seen it, but it's really there's a couple of really good slides that kind of show what it were. Where was God speaking with Moses at this point? Where was he speaking with him? What part of the tabernacle was God speaking with him? Where did God always speak? Where did God live? The holiest of holies, the Holy of Holies. That's that tent that contained the Ark of the Covenant, all of those things that were symbols of God's presence in the lives of the Israelites. So God is with Moses in this Holy of Holies, and he's speaking with him. Yes. After it was dedicated, after the tabernacle was dedicated and it was basically open for business, that's when only the high priest was able to go in. After Moses met with God, was Moses allowed to go into that Holy of Holies? No. After that point, only the high priest was allowed to go in there. Yes, this was before. This is before the dedication of the temple, or the tabernacle, not temple, the tabernacle. Okay, so he's meeting with him. He's speaking to him basically the same way I'm speaking to you right now, in the tongue that he understood, and he's writing this down. Okay, so then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Command Aaron and his sons, saying, this is the law of the burnt offering. The burnt offering shall be on the hearth upon the altar all night until morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. And the priest shall put on his linen garment, and his linen trousers he shall put on his body, and shall take up the ashes of the burnt offering, which the fire has consumed on the altar, and he shall put them beside the altar. Then he shall take off his garments, put on other garments, and carry the ashes outside the camp to a clean place. And that fire on the altar shall be kept burning on it. It shall not be put out. And the priest shall burn wood on it every morning, and lay the burnt offering on it, and he shall burn on it the fat of the peace offerings. A fire shall always be burning on the altar. It shall never go out." Okay? So what do we kind of understand from this verses 8 through 13? What do we see what's happening here? That fire that was originally kindled was never supposed to be put out, which means what? There were priests that was their job. There were priests that their responsibility was to go and hew wood and bring that wood, and that wood was to be put on that altar, and that fire was never to be let out. Now, does that mean that the fire constantly was this big? No, it was constantly supposed to be going on. Why do you think he commanded that? In the middle of the night, now remember, during their nighttime, they weren't doing any of this. The sacrifices were brought during the day, but it's even at night, that fire was not to be let out. Why? Okay. It was basically to demonstrate that God's presence never left the children of Israel. As long as and you know, I like how the way he phrases it. Is that me echoing? Okay, maybe not. Look at what he says. It says in verse. Hang on a second. I'm having a hard time seeing. All right, verse 13. Let's look at that again. Look how he phrases this. A fire shall always be burning on the altar. It shall never go out. Look how he phrases that. Look at the words that he used. A fire shall be constantly burning. A fire is always going to, the fire shall never go out. Look at the way he phrases that and think about that for just a second. How would we have phrased that? Yeah, when God spoke this, it was with the understanding that the people would obey what he said. It was basically showing them in his mind, in God's mind, how this was going to be. The fire shall never go out. He already believed that the children of Israel were going to obey him on this manner. So he was saying that this fire is never going to go out. I mean, he's saying it like that. Not saying, you shall not let the fire go out. He says, the fire shall never go out. It's with the understanding that you're going to do what I tell you to do. You're always going to keep the wood on that fire to keep that fire burning. Even if it dwindles down to a small fire in the evening time, it was still what? What did that fire do? It was still consuming. There's probably stuff still on that fire that was big burnout. What? It was still someplace that you think about, and that once again, the fire. This is not an altar. This was not the size of the altar. Okay, it was not some small thing. It was a huge altar made of stones, and on top of that was where this fire was going on. So what would this have been to the children of Israel? Wherever they were in the encampment, guess what they were going to be able to see? They were going to be able to see that fire going up in the tabernacle. They were going to see that fire on that altar, and it was going to give them, fire has always been a friend to the people. Okay, it's not always been used for good, but a fire has always been. What is it about fire? What does it give us? It definitely gives us warmth. It gives us light. It gives us a sense of companionship. I know if you've ever, I don't know if anybody here has ever been out to camp. When we would go out to camp, one of the things we really enjoyed was when we started a bonfire. Because what does that bonfire do? Everybody gathers around it, and it gives us a sense of fellowship. It gives us a sense of togetherness. And this is what that fire in that tabernacle did for the people. They saw this. This was a chance. It was a sense of community, basically. Everyone in that encampment was able to look down, and they were able to see that tabernacle, and they would see that fire going. This tall altar. They saw this fire going, and it was a sense of it bound them together. They had something in common with one another, and it was a sense of understanding that God was never going to depart from them. As long as they kept their sacrificial system and did what they were to do, God would never depart from them. So this fire was a very important thing. It was one of the reasons he told them never to let it go out. Never let it go out. Also, what? If the fire was going all night, that meant what? There had to be, there's certainly a sacrifice when during the daytime, sacrifices were going on whenever they needed to come and bring a sacrifice. But that meant that there was always somebody in attendance at the tabernacle. There was always a priest whose job was to keep that fire going. So there was always service going on to God. Even when they slept, there was service being rendered to God Almighty in the form of keeping that fire going. So that meant what? Does our service to God ever end? Does it stop? No, it doesn't. Our worship to God continues on and continues on. All right. Also, this would remind them of the importance of their sacrifices. They carried out these sacrifices because of God's great kindness to them. These people were not deserving of God's love, but they received it because he had promised it to them. Hundreds of years before, he had promised his children, he had promised his servant Abraham that he was going to deliver this land to these people. And this was, once again, a reminder of the promise that he gave them. That promise was kept burning. So because of God's great kindness, they carried out this sacrifices, and he would forgive people because of the sacrifices, in the sense of forgiveness that we understand it. Not that forgiveness would occur at that moment, but that true forgiveness would occur with Christ's death on the cross, with the giving of that perfect sacrifice. The sins that had been forgotten for a period of time were forgotten. All of the children of Israel who kept the sacrificial system the way they were supposed to have had their sins erased by Jesus' death on the cross. So, and lastly, he would have fellowship with them because of the sacrifices. So that fire was to remind them of their sacrificial system and of their duty to God for that sacrifice. When you see that fire burning, that put the idea and the thought in your head that I need to I need to make a visit to the tabernacle. I need to acknowledge God in this way, or I need forgiveness for this, or I need this for this. Okay, so then what he says in verse, hang on a second, in verse 10. Well, in verse 9, the idea that she'll be kept on the hearth and upon the altar all night until morning, the idea of the burnt offering. So even that sacrifice, it was offered during the day, but it was to be left on the fire all night until every bit of it was completely consumed. Which, if you've ever burnt raw flesh, it takes a long time for that fire to go to eat through all that. You put a piece of raw meat, it takes a long time for every bit of that to be completely consumed, but it is. So what does it say? It shall be kept on the hearth in verse 9 all night until morning, and the fire of the altar shall be kept burning on it. And look what he says, and the priest shall put on his linen garment and his linen trousers, and that's translated as an undergarment. So basically this is the piece of material that was cut close to the skin, and then he would put on his outer garment on top of that. He shall put on his body, he shall take the ashes of the burnt offering, he shall put them beside the altar. Then what does it say? He shall do what? He changes his garments. So he had one article of clothing in order to take that off of the fire and put it next to the altar. And then he's going to change his clothing in order to take what was left beside that altar, those ashes. And he's going to change his clothing, and he's going to take those things and he's going to take them outside of the camp to a clean place, a place that has been ceremonially cleansed. And there he's going to leave them. What do you think the significance is of changing the clothing? The ceremonial garments remain clean because of what they've been used for. He's going to take these other garments that are going to be used to take this thing that is unclean. He's going to take those to a clean place and dispose of them there. So, but what does that mean? What does that tell us about the idea of changing our clothing, of changing this idea? Where else? I meant to look this up, and for the life of me, I'm having a hard time. I took some medicine this morning. It had some codeine in it, and I've been kind of like this all day long, kind of, But remember what it says. Remember what he says. He says, "Arise, wash your face, change your clothing." And for the life of me, I'm having a hard time remembering it. But the idea here is it's a change of. It's to change. To be ceremonially clean, okay? You wouldn't wear something that was clean to do something that was unclean. You would take garments that were specifically designed for that purpose, is to keep yourself from being spotted, to keep yourself from becoming unclean by touching these things, and keep those ceremonial garments clean. Remember, we're to keep our garments spotless, okay? And that's part of it. Those clothes were to be kept for a specific purpose, and you didn't want to sully them by doing something that would have been considered ceremonially unclean. But this is what the priest was supposed to do: change out one set of garments for the other set of garments, and take those ashes outside of the camp. They weren't to remain inside the camp, because why? They were unclean. Nothing unclean was to remain inside of the camp. That's why you had the latrines. People would use the latrine in their own home, but then you had people that were specifically designated to take that refuse, that human refuse, and take it outside of the camp and dispose of it. Those people were what? When they did that, what were they considered? Unclean. They had to come in and be ceremonially cleansed again in order to come back inside the camp. But everything, it was a defense for God against the people becoming unclean. To take everything that would have been considered that and take it outside of the camp so that the people would remain clean. Now, ceremonially clean. Everybody's going to get physically dirty, but ceremonially they would be clean. What was important about being ceremonially clean? The altar, absolutely. You couldn't come inside the tabernacle if you were ceremonially unclean. And God wanted his people to continually come before him with sacrifice for the things that they had done. So it was important for God for the camp to remain clean. It was important for the camp to remain clean. Okay? So that they would be able to approach God. Also, what? There's some common sense issues as well. That's right. The things that were known in the nations surrounding them weren't found in the children of Israel. God, even before the modern science caught up with them, said, there are things that you shouldn't be doing, and this is one of them. That you don't do this, you don't do this. Why? Because it'll keep you healthier. The idea of quarantine was something that was new. If somebody was sick, God understood that there were some things that were communicable, and He understood it better than the people surrounding them. He said, "These people, they're unclean and they are contagious. You need to take them out of there." Of course, we're going to get into that a little bit further down anyway. All right. What's that? What about? Why do you? Because when that person got there, if he took them to a clean place and he was able to dispose of them in a clean place, he wouldn't have to come in again and be cleaned and be considered and be ceremonially cleansed. So if the priest took garments, specific garments for that purpose, took the ashes to a particular place where that was already clean, when they came back in, they didn't have to go through the big ritual of being cleansed again ceremonially. So they didn't go into a place that was unclean. They took it to a place that was ceremonially clean. They would dispose of the ashes there, and then they would come back in, and they didn't have to go through the big ritual of going through it again. It wasn't a big thing, but it was something that was a little bit more, a lot of hassle, because God, there were specific things that you had to do. Yep, there was a lot of ashes being carried out. Now, these were specific. This type of sacrifice that this happened was a particular type. Not every sacrifice was left on the altar all night. Not all of it was. Many times it was basically put on the altar until it was cooked, and then it was eaten. But there were certain types of sacrifices that were left on there until they were completely consumed. They're completely consumed. Okay? All right. In verse 12, okay, and just real quickly, he says, "Shall burn wood on it every morning and lay the burnt offering in order on it, and he shall burn on it the fat of the peace offerings." And the idea that would make the entire offering a little bit easier to burn. It doesn't explain the reason for putting the fat on top of it, but it was the idea that it was the entire offering. Okay, it was everything, every bit of that animal was laid up on top of there for that whole offering. And it was evident when it was completely consumed. It was the idea that God had accepted their offering. Every bit of it had gone up to God on their behalf, and now they could once again have fellowship. Remember, the peace offering was to make peace between themselves and another person, and peace between them and God. If they felt that they had, it was basically to ask God's blessing on them, make sure that they were in communication with God, in good communication with God, in good standing. So they would go and they would offer this thing up, and it would be completely consumed, and then that would be their sign that they were once again in fellowship with God. So it was the peace offering was a very important one. It was probably one of the offerings that was most often given. People wanted to be in fellowship with God. It's the same consideration when we offer the invitation, and we want people to come and make their desire known to be back in fellowship with the church and back in fellowship with God. And it's an opportunity for them to repent. This was the same type of thing. Our offering, of course, is ourselves. We come and we offer up ourselves as a sacrifice to God. They would come and they would offer an animal, and that animal would be burned up completely on the altar until there was nothing but ashes left, and those ashes would be disposed of. Okay? This offering was probably the one that we find in Exodus chapter 29, verses 38 through 42. And we're not going to read that tonight, but if you want to write that down, you can go to it. And this offering was probably the one that they were offering up in Exodus chapter 29. The priest offered it in the morning and at night for all of the people. And this was in addition to the whole offerings that the people gave in chapter 1. They would probably give their own whole offerings on special occasions like their birthdays. And Job chapter 1, verse 4 through 5 is probably describing a much earlier period of time, but it was still the consideration that when this offering was given up, it was to be given up in its entirety. It wasn't to be distributed amongst the people. It was going to be completely consumed. All right? Verses 14 through 23, let's read that real quick. "This is the law of the grain offering. The sons of Aaron shall offer it on the altar before the Lord. He shall take from it his handful of the fine flour of the grain offering with its oil, and all the frankincense which is on the grain offering, and shall burn it on the altar for a sweet aroma as a memorial to the Lord. And the remainder of it Aaron and his sons shall eat. With unleavened bread it shall be eaten in a holy place. In the courtyard of the tabernacle of meeting they shall eat it." So this is not something that was to be given for provision of the priests and their families. This is something that was to be eaten by the priests themselves in the place of meeting, in the holy place, that part of the tabernacle that was adjacent to the most holy place. It was you would have if you went in, and I'll give you an example. Just if we're looking up here, east, west, north, and south. Okay, east, west, north, and south. As you came in, you would have the large basin of water, and that basin of water was big enough to take both people and animals down into, because they would clean these animals before they would offer them up. You know, the animals are walking through and they haven't been cleaned yet. This is a place they could wash them. And then as you're traveling in, then you would have the large fire. You'd have that large altar. And then right behind, if you're looking into it, you'd see the bowl, you'd see the fire behind it, and then behind that you would see the holy place. This holy place is where the priests were able to go, and they were able to offer up their service to God. And this is where the priests, after this grain offering, they would take their portion of it and they would eat it themselves, just the priests, in that holy place. And they would eat it as God described, the idea of unleavened bread. God's still very specific in the type of how they were to eat it. And the idea of unleavened bread was the only thing they were able to eat it with. And it shall not be baked with leaven. I have given it as their portion of my offerings made by fire. It is most holy, like the sin offering and the trespass offering. All the males among the children of Israel, children of Aaron, I'm reading it. All the males among the children of Aaron may eat it. It shall be a statute forever in your generations concerning the offerings made by fire to the Lord. Everyone who touches them must be holy. Now, what does that mean? The idea of everyone who touches them must be holy. Okay. Holy meaning what? Set aside. Okay. Everyone. Now, could the individuals be holy? The idea here with the holiness under the old covenant, is holiness under the old covenant the same as holiness under the new covenant? Yes. The people were holy. God had set them apart from the nations of the world. Now, what does that mean in regards to the people who eat it? All it means is that the people who eat it must have clean hearts and clean hands. They must be ceremonially clean, for one, and for another, their hearts must be pure before God before they can eat of this food that's being offered up. So everyone who eats of this food must be holy. In other words, your heart must be in the right place. You have to be in a right relationship with God in order to do that. Even, guess what? Even the priests weren't immune to falling away and acting in an unacceptable manner. Sure. Yes, very much so. Taking of the unleavened bread. And that gets to the whole idea. The whole idea here is, when we partake of this, are we to be holy when we do it? Yes. Are we to have a clean heart? Yes. Are our hands supposed to be clean? Not that was a ceremonial thing, but I hope everybody's hands are clean when they partake of it. Yes. It's a spiritual thing when it talks about our hands. Our hand. Now, even the elders during Jesus' time believed in the idea of washing of the hands, and it was, of course, to do two separate things. One was to clean your hands. They believed they were very clean people. That had been passed down from generation to generation to generation. The idea of keeping clean, but it's also the idea of being ceremonial clean. I'm washing myself. I'm showing my obedience to God and making themselves ceremonially clean. And yes, the same way that our hands are to be clean when we partake of this feast, this unleavened bread, our hands are to be clean. We can't come before God with sin on us and partake of this feast and it do anything. We're not in fellowship with God if we come and sin is in our heart. When we partake of this, all we're doing is eating some bread and drinking some juice. When our hands are clean and we come in a ceremonially clean fashion, then we are truly partaking in remembrance of Jesus Christ. And that's how things work. And it worked the same way here. The idea that everyone who touches them must be holy. No. And I'm sure everybody here has seen people who have visited. They're not members of the Lord's church. They're members of a denomination, or they're unchurched altogether, and they partake of it. Should we stop them from doing it? No. Why? Because it's not hurting them to do it. It's not hurting them at all to do it. Is it a teaching opportunity? Yes. And I've always looked at the Lord's Supper as the focal point of our worship service, and it is very much a teaching opportunity when we do it. And I appreciate it when people who men who preside at the Lord's Supper have something that has something of importance to say. And when they make those points, and when we educate the congregation as well as people who may be visiting with us, this is why we do what we do. This is why we do it on the first day of the week. This is what we are doing. This is what it accomplishes when we do it. And also the idea here is saying, when we do it, it goes to our benefit. It is a spiritual nourishment. It's not much of a physical nourishment. There's not much there. But spiritually, it's very nourishing to us because of what we're doing. But yes, absolutely. It does not hurt them at all to do it, but it is a teaching opportunity. We can let them know what it is we're doing and why it is specifically for members of the Lord's church. Okay? All right. Verse 19, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, this is the offering of Aaron and his sons, which they shall offer to the Lord. So now this is something for the priesthood. This is the offering of Aaron and his sons, beginning on the day when he is anointed. Okay? Who's anointed? The priest, Aaron and the priests. Okay? Aaron was anointed as high priest, and his sons were anointed as priests at the same time. Beginning on the day when he is anointed, 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour as a daily grain offering, half of it in the morning and half of it at night. So what were the priests to be doing? They had something to do every day. Every day they were to give this grain offering to God. So every single day, it shall be made in a pan with oil. When it is mixed, you shall bring it in. So it's not to be brought in before it's done the way it was supposed to be done. When it is mixed, you shall bring it in. The baked pieces of the grain offering you shall offer for a sweet aroma to the Lord. The priest from among his sons who is anointed in his place shall offer it. It is a statute forever to the Lord. It shall be wholly burned, which means what? Nothing left of it. It's not basically not cooked. It is completely and wholly burned up. All right. It shall be wholly burned. For every grain offering for the priest shall be wholly burned. It shall not be eaten. So it's not to be eaten. Okay. The idea here, of course, let's see. Just a moment. Let me get to it. All right. The chief priest or the high priest made this offering on the first day of his service. And this was the day when the people anointed him. The idea of anointed meaning what? What does it mean to be anointed? Ordained, which means they're set apart. They're set aside for a particular thing. The high priest was set aside for a particular service. Was the high priest to do anything other than serve as a high priest? Was he to have another job? He wasn't. As a matter of fact, what was to aid him in this endeavor? Okay. Right. Right. They didn't till the fields. That's right. He was provided for. He was provided for by the tithes of the people that were bringing those things in. They would go into the storehouse, and then the storehouse would deliver to the priests and their families what they needed in order to survive. It kind of gives the idea. It kind of feeds into how the church works today. The church brings their offerings, and they're set aside in a storehouse. We call it a bank. Set aside in the storehouse, and then those who work in the service of the Lord, that money are delivered to them in the way that the church sees fit. So it kind of plays the idea of the new covenant and the old covenant are kind of coming into play here. What did Paul think about the idea of paying preachers? They're worthy of their hire. He said, and Paul even says that I could request a pay. I could request pay from the church. I choose not to do that. Paul chose not to do that, probably for many reasons. Why do you think it was that Paul did not request pay from the congregations? Right. As he went, the city that he lived in would certainly provide for him. He also worked outside. He worked outside of working for God. He also had a job that he accomplished on his own. It would be very difficult to get him monies if he were to be paid by anybody other than the congregation where he was. It'd be difficult to get those to him. Paul probably wanted that money to be spent in the local area, which makes good sense. You pay the person who's working with you, not the person who's serving somewhere else. And that's not including, of course, the idea of a missionary that might be working somewhere else. But this kind of feeds into this idea of the priests were to taken care of so that they would not be tempted to go and do something else. And it wasn't until the people were not bringing their sacrifices the way they should that the priests began to pervert it, because they weren't being taken care of. They weren't being provided for by the congregations, the children of Israel. Mm-hmm.
Is to pay someone, they feel an ownership of that person, and it would not allow the freedom to go other places. If I'm paying your salary, I want you here.
Right.
I may not be willing to maybe go off and teach somewhere.
Right.
Your grandfather did that. He always had his job, and once he was where he was supposed to be, he found a congregation that needed someone, and that's how he began his ministry, was unpaid by a congregation, but a pulpit preacher for them.
Yeah, he was a big believer in he also believed in a loyalty to a congregation. He didn't hop churches, go from place to place to place. When you found a congregation, you found the work, and you found what was necessary, and you devoted yourself to that congregation. I know that there's a big tendency now, and even amongst preachers today, that the work of the church. Don't take anything away from this. I'm not saying that they're not dedicated to their congregations, but obviously they many times will find their attention being pulled from place to place. I know of a couple of preachers, not from this area. Just telling you right now, not from this area, but they spend as much time going out on gospel meetings as they do at their own congregation, preaching from the pulpit and speaking at different events and things like that. And are those great? Yeah, that's fantastic. If the congregation's willing to let them go and do that, that's great. But you wonder, how much time can you spend away from a congregation before you start losing your efficacy? It's kind of necessary for you to remain where you are. This is the congregation that wants you there. So there is that great possibility, and I think it's changed somewhat over the years. That's become more of a recent phenomenon. Sure. Yeah. There's nothing in Scripture to prevent it, and there's several things in Scripture that talk about how that would be a. Many people take the verse that speaks of let the elder who rules well be considered worthy of double honor, and that is not only the honor of serving, but also the honor of being paid for their service. And I personally would have no issue with paying an eldership for doing the job that they do. Now, I've never seen a place that hires them as full-time paid eldership, but certainly a stipend because a good eldership, a true eldership, they're going to be constantly busy. They're going to be visiting. They're going to be doing all these things. And the idea of supporting them in that work, I think, is a fantastic work. If a congregation can afford it and wants to do it, I certainly would not have a problem with it at all. And I think that does show the idea of an eldership that's worthy of a double honor. And the idea of not only giving the honor that is due to them as their service, but also the honor that's due to them as partial pay. But I've seen congregations that do that, and it's like anything else. It's always open to issues and problems. But if they're handled correctly, then I don't think there's anything wrong with it whatsoever. I think there's a couple of congregations in the area. Some of the larger congregations are able to do that. Yeah. Right. But if you think about it, a lot of older men who may be retired and are not working, that small stipend may go a long way towards assisting them in their work. If you pay for gas, and of course nowadays you think about maybe a cell phone or something like that, or but giving them a small stipend every month would certainly give them it's difficult. The job of an eldership is difficult enough. And I'll be honest with you, this probably feeds more into the idea of the priesthood than even a preacher would. The idea of men who are not working in and of themselves and are serving as an eldership. I think this would be a good example of that. and the idea of helping them out, making their work as easy as possible, because the work of an eldership is not easy. You have one group, it seems that the church, where there are problems, the church is divided up into two things. One, they want the eldership involved in every single small, tiny little detail that you could possibly think of. And then you've got another congregation that if they've got an eldership, they don't want the eldership involved in anything. They're just in place because they need an eldership. They're not really doing anything. A good congregation, a congregation that's sound, is going to have the elders doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. That's shepherding the flock. They're not going to be picking out songbook colors or what chandeliers go in the auditorium. They're going to be shepherding the lost, and that's their job. And if they're doing it right, that's all they're going to be involved in. That's why you have deacons. That's why deacons are the unsung heroes of the church. They're the ones that are, making budgets and getting Bible school curriculum and all of those things. So, but yes, absolutely. A paid eldership, there's nothing in Scripture to prevent it. And there's a lot of things to promote it. Absolutely. Okay. Anyway, verses 19 through 23 is talking about the priest corn offering. We've not read about this. The first time we read about this offering. It's the first time we're reading about this thing that the priests have a responsibility to bring something. Now, they're not. Where are they getting this thing that they're giving up? The people are bringing it. So this shows how important it was for the people to bring their stuff. The priests themselves were to offer up something. They had an offering that they were to give up, but the only way they could get what they needed for that offering is if the people were doing what was necessary. The people were supposed to bring that grain offering. And they were supposed to bring those tithes that were to be kept up in that storeroom, and then the priest would be able to access this. There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you think about it. That's the idea here of say paying a preacher. When I put back into the plate on Sunday morning comes from the congregation. I'm dependent. I'm dependent on the congregation to make my contribution. I mean, that's not some sort of a plea. I'm just saying that's how important it is for the people, even into the old covenant, to bring in the things that they were to bring in. I mean, that's how the priests did what they did. When the priests offered up their sacrifices, not just the grain offering, but their sacrifices to once again be brought closer to God. They didn't have those animals. Those animals were brought in by the people. Okay, so it was very important that the people did what they were supposed to do, so that the priests could do as they were commanded to do as well. All right. So the idea here is an important one for everybody that was supposed to do their job. Everybody was supposed to do what they were supposed to do in order to make this right. All right. So chapter 6, 24 through 30. Also, the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, this is the law of the sin offering. In the place where the burnt offering is killed, the sin offering shall be killed before the Lord. It is most holy. The priest who offers it for sin shall eat it. In a holy place it shall be eaten, in the court of the tabernacle or meeting." Okay, so this is not a place where they didn't go into the holy place to eat this. This was supposed to be eaten in that courtyard, that big courtyard, that open courtyard where the tabernacle was. In the court of the tabernacle of meeting, everyone who touches its flesh must be holy. So people who handle this offering are to be in good standing with God. They are to be ceremonially clean with God. And when its blood is sprinkled on any garment, you shall wash that on which it was sprinkled in a holy place. So what does it say about the blood? Is the blood clean or unclean? Blood is unclean. And that was to remain that way for the children of Israel up and through the time of Christ. Blood was unclean, although blood was necessary. Blood was necessary for sacrifice, but the blood itself was unclean. And if the garment became spattered with it, which guess what? It's going to happen. Those garments were going to be spattered with blood all the time because those sacrifices were going on all the time. So this is a constant thing, but this is the idea of getting to the idea of being washed. Our garments are not to be when our garments become spotted, what are we to do with them? We're to wash them. How are we washed as Christians? It's funny that because they were to wash their garments because of blood. How are we washed? In the blood. Okay, you see how the Old Testament and the New Testament how they dovetail into each other. They washed them because of the unclean blood. We are washed in the clean blood of Jesus Christ, the pure blood of Jesus Christ. So it's fascinating to just watch how this unfolds and how the old informs the new. Okay, so it is to be washed on. We're to wash that on which it was sprinkled in a holy place. But the earthen vessel in which it is boiled, this idea of this offering, The earthen vessel in which it is boiled shall be what? But which means it's not to be used again after it's been boiled in this. So you think there was probably a cottage industry of people who did nothing more than to make these earthen vessels so that people could use them, break them, then they would make them again, break them, make them, and break them again. This was a busy place. The tabernacle was not a, we think of churches in this kind of a sleepy type of thing where you walk in and it's kind of quiet and there's not much going on. You can imagine what this tabernacle was like, what this altar was like. Man, you would hear the animals crying out. You would hear the cattle. You'd hear the goats. You'd hear the sheep. You would hear people talking. This was not a quiet place where everything was very solemn. This is a place where things were going on. It was loud. It was noisy. It was smoky. It was constantly filled with the smoke of the blood or the burnt offerings of these animals that was going up. So and compare and contrast that with what we have today. Church is very solemn, very you get a lot of people, boy, once you come into the building, it's, don't say anything. You just quietly come in and take your seat. I kind of like it more like we had it, where we talk and we're fellowshipping, we're visiting with one another before the worship service even begins. We're talking, and then afterwards we're fellowshipping all the way out the door and even into the parking lot until we get to our car. Sometimes we go somewhere to eat and we fellowship again. So it's a big, I like the way that we do it versus the way that a lot of the world does it, where the church is some sort of a holy place. It's sacred and it's not to be used in certain ways. And this is a building and it's to be used constantly if we can use it constantly. But I would have found it. I think we would have found it fascinating to go to the tabernacle under the old law, and after this, even to the temple under the old law. Constantly things going on. Mm-hmm. Yes. And see, we also have to look at sacrifice versus tithe. The tithe was never a tithe was not sacrifice. A tithe was not burnt up. A tithe was brought in by the people to sustain the priesthood. Then you had a grain offering, but in some cases that grain offering was to be a fine flour. In some cases it was to be the whole kernel. It was to be brought in as a whole kernel of wheat or whatever the grain may be. It was to be brought in a particular way. It depended on what was being offered up. Was it the grain offering? So if you look at the grain offering, look up real quick in verse 20. This is the one, of course, for the priests. This is the priest's offering. This says that their grain offering was what? It was 1/10 of an ephah of fine flour. So that was their offering. That was how it was supposed to be presented to God. Their offering was of fine flour. Other grain offerings, it's not always fine flour. Sometimes it was was it corn? It was a corn offering. Well, you don't they didn't grind the corn into fine flour. They brought it in as a whole kernel. So it just depends on what kind of sacrifice was being offered up. But remember, the priest didn't have the ability to mill this flour. So that what they were to be offered up was something that had already been brought in by the people as a tithe. They were taking this from the tithe that was brought up, the tenth that everybody was to bring of their first fruits. All right. So, but in an earthen vessel it shall be broken, and if it is boiled in a bronze pot, it shall be both scoured and rinsed in water, and all the males among the priests may eat it. It is most holy. But no sin offering from which any of the blood is brought into the tabernacle of meeting to make atonement in the holy place shall be eaten. It shall be burned in the fire. Okay, so it kind of gives kind of sums up what's remaining of this idea of the offering. It is to be burned up holy. There's nothing to be eaten from this. Nothing. It says no sin offering from which any of the blood is brought into the tabernacle of meeting to make atonement shall be eaten. All of it to be burned up. Why is that about the sin offering? Why would you eat a sin offering, right? What's that sin offering supposed to be done? You don't want any of it left. It's want it completely gone. What does that represent? It's gone. When it's gone, when that sin offering is gone, what that told the people, what that sign to the people was that God has rolled it away. He's forgotten about it. He's forgotten about it for a time. But what happens? What has to happen next? You have to do it again. Okay. That sin has to constantly be atoned for, to be taken out of God's, so that God will not remember it anymore. Okay. All right, we're going to stop here, and we're going to go. We're going to do probably 7 through 9 next week, because we're going to move a little quicker now that we've gotten the idea about what all the sacrifices were, what all the offerings were. Now we can move a little bit quicker. So we're going to do 7, 8, and 9 next week, and looking forward to it. And if you have any questions, just see me after. I'll enlighten you as much as I know how. But we want to give the opportunity, if there's anyone in need of prayer, we want to give you that opportunity to make it known to the congregation while we stand and while we sing.